Hi, class. So, just very briefly, we will go over the primary and secondary sources, which are very important in history, as a sort of um, caveat. When I'm teaching about primary and secondary sources, I always tell this story. Primary and secondary sources are what history is all about. That is how you prove any argument, any historical argument. At least you have to have your evidence. And if you go shopping like me and you're addicted to shopping, you will know that receipts are very important, right? And so, about perhaps you all are too young to remember, but about 10 to 15 years, well, 10 years ago, um, people used to say things and people would say, if that's true, well, then show me your receipts. Basically, show me the proof of what you're saying. And that is exactly what primary and secondary sources are. They are the proof of any historical argument. So if you should say that the United States or the 13 colonies won the American Revolution, what proof do you have of that other than George Washington's word or Thomas Jefferson's word, right? If you were to say that theoretically Donald Trump is the worst president ever, right? We will need to show proof of that. There's a rating scale for these things. If you were to say that Ronald Reagan was the best president ever, what proof do you have of that, right? And what is best? And if that's subjective, then what evidence do you have to prove best? It is the same for all historical arguments, and now we'll break down sources. The reason that primary and secondary sources are important in this course is that because you will have an assignment based on a primary source that you have to choose. Just to briefly go over it. So a primary source is an original first-hand account of any event or time period. It's usually written or made during or close to the event or period, or its original creative writing or works of art. Examples of primary source: we have archives, photographs, audio recordings, journals, letters, diaries, speeches, scrapbooks, published books and newspapers, government publications, oral histories, records of organizations, autobiographies, and memoirs, artifacts. Just to pause very briefly, one of the more interesting things about primary sources that we create them every day, right? So if in 50 years someone comes back and says, how was 2020, right? How did students deal with COVID-19 at Historically Black College? Or how did students return to universities during 2020 global pandemic? The records of organizations, the oral histories, the autobiographies and memoirs, if you're keeping a journal, the books and newspapers and magazine clippings could all be used as primary sources for any of those questions. Your clothes that you're wearing right now, if people were asking, how did fashion look during the global pandemic of 2020? Your clothing could be used as a primary source to answer that question. Oral histories, if any of you have done any interviews or anything like that, they could be used as a primary source 20 years from now. For some kind of historical examples of primary sources, we have journals, letters, and diaries. Think of the Diary of Anne Frank. Think of the narrative of Frederick Douglass, or any sort of personal account of the time. What's another one that's good? Newspapers, of course, are all great primary sources. If we were to pull up what happened during 2005, August 25th, 2005, we could find a published newspaper that could tell us that, which would be a great primary source. As always, autobiographies and memoirs are always primary sources. Secondary sources. Pause. So for the most important thing to remember is that during your primary source assignment, you must select your primary source from the period that we discuss in class. So that is about from 1400 until 1867, right? And so that primary source must be an original first-hand account of any event during or time period during the course we discuss, during the events we discuss, or the time period we discuss. A secondary source analyzes and interprets a primary source. Is a second-hand account of historical event. it interprets creative work. It's a secondary source, interprets, assigns value, and draws conclusion about primary sources. So great examples of secondary source. Your textbook. No one in your textbook is from 1865, not Eric Foner, not any of the people who contributed to the textbook. So the textbook is only analyzing and interpreting primary source. If you've purchased the textbook, you will see that Eric Foner uses plenty of primary sources in the book, but he uses them to interpret. Criticism or commentaries. If you are watching a newscaster tell you about a crash that is happening, however, they are not there, secondary source. And articles that analyze or discuss ideas and events. So we have noticed a lot of like op-eds. So political commentators who are talking about, all sorts of things now. Those are all secondary sources, especially if they're discussing primary works, right? Encyclopedias are great secondary sources. Book, art, and theater reviews. If you are looking for reviews on Black is King from people who probably have not seen the movie, or, those are all secondary sources, right? None of them are primary sources. Monographs written about the topic. So any historical book written about the Great Depression of 1929, right? And the writer did not live during that time. So those are all secondary sources. So another caveat is they're usually in the form of published works such as journals, articles, or books, but may include radio or television documentaries or conference proceedings. Again, for your assignment that happens towards the end of the semester, you must select a primary source. It is important that you do not select a secondary source because that's not the assignment, but also those are not things that I want to get you to interpret. I want you to interpret something that took place something that was written and took place during the time period that we discussed in class. As always, we will go over more primary sources as we continue instruction. If you have any questions about a primary source that you would like to send in for discussion, I'm always available to do that, to tell you if it's a primary or secondary source. This will be uploaded to Blackboard and it will stay here for the duration of the semester. So I hope if you don't understand anything, you reach out. Again, thank you for listening. And I hope to see you all, or I hope to speak with you all soon.